Erin- Hello, my name is Erin Barton, and I'm an associate professor at Vanderbilt University. And I am thrilled to be here today. I guess this will be recorded, so it's not the same day as you're watching it, but that's okay. I am going to be presenting several examples of research that I have done over the years that focus on increasing play complexity in young children with autism and other disabilities. This is a line of research that I have been engaged in since my doctoral work, and one of the most exciting parts about this research is I have conducted lots of replication studies with my students. So I am excited to share the practical aspects of this work with you all today, as well as the research and next steps regarding our research. The agenda for today is I'm going to go over 8 total studies, but before I get into the research, I'm going to talk about how to define play and what is play. And as I will talk about when I talk about play, I think it's critically important that we identify what we're talking about when we want to teach a new skill. So people call this operationalizing a skill, people call it writing a goal. It is incredibly important to have a really clear operationalized definition of the skill you're trying to teach before you teach it, before you know if the child or the student is making progress, so that you know if your teaching is working. And I think this is particularly important when we're talking about play, because play can be so idiosyncratic, play can be so flexible, play can occur across settings and materials, and those are all characteristics of play that make it so important for young children and also make it occasionally hard to define. So the first step in really teaching play is to know what we're talking about and to operationalize play. So I'm going to start with that. And then I'm going to talk about 8 different studies. So there's 7 studies focused on teaching play, and then 1 study focused on how to coach teachers to teach play. You'll see I did a little bit of that throughout each of the 7 studies, but really the 8th study is going to specifically focus on that. Before I get into any of it, though, I want to talk a little bit about why play is important. And during a typical presentation, in-person presentation or a live webinar, I would send that question out to you. So actually, I am going to pause for a minute, and I want you to think about why play is important. What are the reasons why we might teach play? Why am I focusing on play? So I just want you to spend a couple seconds thinking about that right now. Okay, hopefully you have some thoughts as to why play is important. And the reasons why you think play is important are very good reasons, I'm sure, and probably some of you have very similar reasons. One of the reasons why I talk about play as being so critically important is it's because what children do. It's because it is something that you see children do across contexts, across settings, across materials, across people, across play partners. They play in different activity centers and classrooms. They play at home, they play outside, they play with their friends, they play with their siblings, they play with their parents. And so play is something that children do. Also because, actually, let me make this a presentation. Sorry, I should have done that earlier. Because I am the presenter and I get to make the slides, I embedded lots of pictures of my child. Obviously, I'm very biased, but I think he's incredibly cute. He's almost 7 years old now, so these pictures are dated, but these are lots of examples of him playing and how he used to play, and obviously still does play quite a bit. Sometimes he plays at airports with mom in academia. He has done his fair share of travel too. So this is an example of him playing with a piece of cardboard in an airport back in the days when we could travel. So children engage in play. It is perfectly appropriate and acceptable to teach children with disabilities the skills that their peers are engaged in. So there are also some additional reasons why play is important for children with disabilities. Um, I'm going to talk about 4 of them. So let me just show you all 4, and then I'm going to walk through them. So this first one, I moved this to the top. This is often something that I talk about as kind of being a last rationale, but I moved it to the top just given the current state of the world. And that is the practical nature of play. When children can play, when children can engage in the environment in meaningful ways, it frees up time for their caregivers to do the other things that they need to do to run a household or to work. And these days, this rationale for play is particularly important, right? With all of us stuck at home due to the pandemic. So children who are better players, either independent players or players with their siblings or friends, will afford their caregivers more opportunities to do the things that they need to do, whether that's work or teach their siblings or play with their siblings or just run a household or just relax. And so that's the practical nature of play. I don't have data to support that necessarily, but I think most of us, especially these days, can understand why that is socially valid and really can impact the quality of life for families if they have children who know how to independently play, even for just small chunks of the day, small periods of time. It can really make a difference for their caregivers. We also know that play is predictive. So we know that children who are better players at ages 2 and 3 have better communication and social skills when they're older at ages 7, 8, and 9. And that might be, and so of course that's associative. So that's an association. It's not a causation that we know of. There's a relationship there though, which means that there's something there that is interesting about play, and that children who are better players when they're little tend to have better social and communication skills. And there are lots of reasons why that might be the case, right? And one of them is because play is a critically important context for practicing social and communication skills, for practicing motor skills, for practicing a variety of skills that we know children need to learn and need to practice and need to learn as they grow. We also know that play is the context for many evidence-based practices for young children, including young children with autism. So many of the naturalistic approaches, even some of the more direct approaches with young children occur within a play context. The issue then is children who do not have the play skills, we're less likely to be able to embed learning opportunities into those play-based contexts if children don't have the play skills they need to engage in play. And so play in and of itself provides a critically important context for us to embed a variety of learning opportunities and many evidence-based practices. Play is also a really good context for assessing skills. So we can assess children's social skills, communication skills, motor skills, problem-solving skills, adaptive skills through play. But we need to make sure children know how to play before we can use it as a context for teaching or assessing. And again, we also know that children with typical development play. And so if we want to make sure that children with disabilities have opportunities to engage with their peers with typical development or their siblings, we need to teach them to engage in the same or similar behaviors. And that's play. And just a little bit of repetition to really bring this point home. Children with typical development play. And so that is a good rationale for why we would teach children with disabilities to play. We also often talk about play as being a pivotal skill. And what I mean by pivotal skill is that it's a skill that affords children opportunities to then learn other skills that are also critically important. So we sometimes call this a behavioral cusp. And there are many examples of this, and play is an example of this. Other examples are walking, crawling or walking. When babies first learn to crawl or walk, that affords them many other opportunities to independently engage in the environment, right? As soon as children can start to crawl and get around, they can explore their environment and learn many other skills, including other motor skills like walking. A big one, probably the most important behavioral cost, we would say, for young children, other than language or communication, is imitation. And so we know it's really difficult to teach children new skills if they are not imitative, either vocal or motor imitative. And so if a child isn't imitative, oftentimes that's the first thing we want to focus on when we start working with a child. We want to teach them how to imitate so that they can learn from us and learn from their peers. Play also, like imitation, like walking and crawling, is a pivotal skill. When children can learn to play, we know that that leads to many other skills. The rationale for thinking about play as a pivotal skill is that there's a developmental sequence to play. It gets more complex as children get better at playing. As children learn more about objects, they demonstrate more sophisticated play skills. We also know that play has been related to the development of other cognitive skills, such as self-regulation, metacognition, and many problem-solving skills. We also know that play teaches children how to be independent and how to solve problems, especially social problems, which can be really important for young children to learn. The other rationales for teaching play is that other agencies, people who have way more power than me, have asserted and are proponents of the importance of play. So one example of this, I'm going to show 3 examples of this, but one is the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. They asserted that play is the right of every child because it is essential to the cognitive, physical, social, and emotional well-being of children and youth. And so this is an important thing to consider as we're teaching young children to play. We also know that within the US, the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2007, in a policy statement, asserted that child-led play, and they support child-led play as it helps children learn to use complex social behaviors and self-advocate for their needs. So then in 2015, I guess I don't have the date on this slide, but this was in 2015, the US Departments of Health and Human Services and Education came out with a policy statement regarding early childhood inclusion. And within that policy statement regarding early childhood inclusion, they asserted the importance of play. And they said that, like all children, it's critical for children with disabilities to be exposed to a variety of rich experiences where they can learn in the context of play and everyday interactions and engage with their peers with and without disabilities. And so they emphasize play as a critically important context for young children with disabilities. Now, what's important to remember there is that we need to teach children to play, and many children with disabilities will have delays in play. And so we need to make sure that children have the play skills they need such that there can be a play context. Okay, so I went over the rationale for play. So I provided a rationale for play. And now what I want to do is I'm going to talk, like I promised, before we really get into how to teach. As I said, I think it's really important that we know what we're talking about. And play, as I said, can be vague in the definitions and the descriptions. And also, I guess that although all of you probably had similar rationales for why play is important, if I could, I would collect this data. My guess is if I asked you all to define play, the definitions of play that you would come up with, although probably all correct and accurate, would be vastly different. Because play is so idiosyncratic and it can occur across so many different types and materials. and activities, that it's going to be very different. So it's really important that we have some common definitions, and that when you start to teach play, you operationalize exactly what you're going to teach. So I'm going to go over some definitions of play, and I'm going to give you what I think is a really good starting point for when you get to actually teaching play. Now, when you are teaching play, and I will say this multiple times, you need to come up with an individual operationalized definition of what you're going to focus on for that child. I'm going to give you some starting points, some places to start as far as so I'm going to talk about two different overarching play types. These really are, when you think about play, the best way to think about it, in my opinion, is across these two main play types. That's social play and object play, or non-social play. Within these types, there are multiple different categories, and I'm going to go over each of those. But really, how I want you to start thinking about play is according to these two types, knowing that there's a lot of overlap. So children are playing with objects while they're playing with each other. But when we think about teaching it, we're going to focus on these aspects separately, so that we know if children are making progress and if what we're doing is working. So we are going to talk about these two overarching play types. First, I'm going to talk about social play, and then I'm going to talk about object play. And really, in the rest of this presentation, we're going to focus on object play and really how children play with objects, but it's important to talk about this other type of play, and to know that while children are playing with objects, they can be playing with other children, and that we teach children to play with objects so that they will play with other children or near other children. So social play, in 1932, Mildred Parton, as part of her dissertation, her doctoral dissertation, developed a social play taxonomy. And as you can see from these terms already, I'm sure many of you have heard of many of these terms before. So she came up with these categories, and they are still relevant and used today. There's really no reason to come up with new categories, because these have stood the test of time and they are still relevant and very useful today. And so the 6 categories are unoccupied, solitary, onlooker, parallel, associative, and cooperative. And I'm going to go over each of these. So unoccupied is, and what's important with social play is we're defining play relative to what children are doing relative to their peers. So we're defining play according to what children are doing relative to their peers. There's a little bit about objects in one of the categories, in actually 3 of the categories, but it's really relative to what their peers are doing. Object play is focused specifically on what children are doing with objects. And so they can be doing that with or without their peers. And so these types of play overlap for sure. You can be engaged in parallel play and some different types of object play. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But again, when we're teaching, it's important to think about these 2 overarching categories. What am I going to focus on? And then what within these categories am I going to focus on? Again, knowing the whole time that there's overlap. So the first type of play that Mildred Parton defined within social play, her social play taxonomy, is unoccupied. And that's simply when children are not playing relative to their peers. They're not engaged with objects. They're not engaged with each other. The next type is solitary play. And we see lots of children with disabilities do this. Children with autism tend to engage in lots of repetitive solitary play. And that's when children are playing by themselves and not watching or looking at, really tend to not be attending to their peers at all. We absolutely see infants and young children engaged in play of this type, and toddlers. We will expect to see babies and toddlers engage in solitary play. We want to move them towards onlooker and parallel play. So the whole point is to move children towards onlooker and parallel play. I mean, at home, when there aren't children around, we want to see children engaged in solitary play, and we will continue to see preschoolers in classrooms engaged in solitary play some of the time. But we want to help them, to teach them how to engage in more parallel associative play as they're in preschool. Onlooker play is when children are watching their friends engage in play. And so we see this a lot in infant classrooms and in toddler classrooms. And again, this is why peer imitation and teaching children to imitate their peers can be so important, because they're learning a lot from watching their friends play. We will see this in preschool classrooms, absolutely. Perfectly typical to see this in children engage in this type of play in preschool classrooms. But again, we want to move children towards engaging in more parallel and associative play in those preschool 3, 4, 5-year-old classrooms. Parallel play is what we'll see by preschoolers often. And we want to see toddlers and 3 and 4-year-olds engage in parallel play. And that's when parallel play is when children are playing near their peers. We often say proximal, but it's just near their peers with similar toys in similar ways. And if you think about it, classrooms are set up. Many classrooms, high quality classrooms, are set up to really facilitate parallel play. There's adequate space in the activity center. There are multiple different toys or materials that are similar so that children can play near each other in similar ways. And again, we want to see toddlers, 3, and we'll see 4 and 5-year-olds engage in this type of play. We want to move those 4 and 5-year-olds into more associative and cooperative play, but it's perfectly typical and okay to see a 3-year-old engage in parallel play for a good part of the day. We want to help those 3-year-olds move away from solitary play and onlooker play into parallel play and maybe even associative play. Associative play is building off of parallel play. So it's when children are playing near each other with similar objects and in similar ways, but they start to talk to each other and share some materials back and forth. So we see this a lot across activity centers and classrooms where children are playing near each other, talking to each other, engaged in and associative play is something that we want to see 4 and 5-year-olds doing. And classrooms should be set up to support this type of play, where children are, again, playing near each other, talking to each other, and sharing materials with each other. Then cooperative play is one of the most complex types of social play that we'll see young children engage in. Cooperative play is where children play with each other, near each other, with similar toys. But what makes it different from associative play is that children have a common goal and will assign roles to each other. So this is really where we see that really complex dramatic play where children are assigning roles and they have a common goal. We often expect to see 3 and 4-year-olds engaged in this type of play, but we really shouldn't. Of course, there will be some precocious 3 and 4-year-olds who will probably be skilled at this type of play. But really, children aren't independently going to engage in cooperative play until they're 5, 6 years old. Now, what we do want to see is adult-supported cooperative play. So absolutely, we can and will see lots of cooperative play occurring in 3 and 4 and 5-year-old classrooms with adult support, when adults maybe give them a common goal, start assigning some roles, or give them suggestions for assigned roles. And that's great and a great way to support cooperative play. But again, we're not going to see children independently engage in cooperative play till they're a little bit older. Okay. Now, I went over, so that was social play taxonomy. Again, that taxonomy has been around for a long time. Mildred Parton shared that with us decades ago, and it's still relevant and useful today. and pretty clear and straightforward. Object play is a little bit messier. So the object play taxonomies are a little bit messier, and they many people have given us object play taxonomies, including myself, and we're going to go over that one. There are some consistencies across them, and there are some inconsistencies, and I'm going to talk about those. So Sherratt and Peter gave us an object play taxonomy, and Chance gave us an object play taxonomy. You can see there's some similarities, some differences. They all have symbolic play. Okay, so and there are many other object play taxonomies that exist. Those were just two examples. The consistencies include that they generally do move from the exploration of toys to more complex play. So kind of that sensory motor actions, behaviors with toys to more complex toy play, such as symbolic play. They all include some sort of sensory experiences, whether it's actual sensory motor play or relational play, or physical play. They also often, most of them talk about the functionality of objects, and most of them include some sort of functional play as a type of play. They also all, as nature of being an object play taxonomy, do focus on the importance of objects and toys and what children are doing with toys. Okay, there also are many inconsistencies, and the inconsistencies are important to note because, again, what we're doing here is we're defining what we're teaching, right? So we're defining play so that we can teach it and make sure that we teach appropriately. So the inconsistencies include, big inconsistency is how pretend play is defined. And that's important because oftentimes in preschool classrooms, that's what we're teaching, right? We're teaching children. Children have many of the other types of play, but if we're focused on more complex play, the type of play that we're often teaching is pretend play. And we're going to talk quite a bit about that. So the taxonomies differ in how they define what pretend play is, and also how they define pretend play relative to functional play, and whether or not there are some aspects of functional play that can be non-literal. And so we're going to talk about that. So major inconsistency and limitation in defining play is this lack of consistency in pretend play. And so what I wanted to do was to define, and the biggest issue really was pretend play relative to functional play, and how those two types of play relate to each other or don't relate to each other. And so I created as I mentioned, my doctoral advisor, Mark Willery, and I created a pretend play taxonomy that we use across our research studies, really to focus on pretend play, but also to define pretend play in a way that is different from functional play, and is in a way that makes it feasible and accessible to real life teachers in classrooms who are trying to teach children to engage in play. And so some of the things I thought about were this non-literal nature of symbolic play, and that might be important, and then also consider what children are actually doing with toys. So we did lots of observations. And again, I have lots of cute pictures of my very cute little son engaged in play. So this is the publication that really talks about our pretend play taxonomy. It's published in Infants and Young Children in 2010. And here's my pretend play taxonomy. So in the pretend play taxonomy, there are two, and again, this is a type of object play taxonomy. So it's object play focused. It's not social play focused. It's really focused on what children are doing with objects. And it's really focused on the latter part of object play, the most complex types of object play, which include pretend play. So it's really just a pretend play taxonomy. And within this taxonomy, I have two kind of overarching types of pretend play. and then some subtypes, which I'm going to talk about. So the two types are functional play with pretense and symbolic play. So functional play with pretense, remember I said that one of the big inconsistencies in the pretend play taxonomy research is this separation, or what is the relation, I guess, between functional play and pretend play. So I really did go to the research, go to the literature, and looked at how researchers had defined it before, and then did lots of observations and came up with what I think is a simple yet specific enough definition of what I call functional play with pretense. So it separates out functional play from pretend play. So we're not talking about just functional play. We're talking about functional play that includes some sort of non-literal use of objects. So functional play would be like just putting puzzles together. So using objects according to their function really is what functional play is. So putting puzzles together, cause and effect toys. So using objects in the manner in which they're meant to be used with the outcome that you're meant to get. Now, functional play with pretense, oops, went too far, is the non-literal use of actual or miniature objects in the manner in which they were intended to be used, but without the reality-based outcome. So what I mean by that is using an object according to its functionality, but not getting the outcome that you should get. And to me, that's a really important distinction from just putting a puzzle together. So there's certainly some sort of non-literal aspect of you stirring a spoon in a bowl without the bowl having anything in it, or taking a sip from a cup without the cup having anything in it, or getting rocking a baby or feeding a baby, using all of those miniature objects that we have in classrooms, the housekeeping objects, dramatic play objects. There are so many of them, and children use them all the time. Using those objects without the reality-based outcome seems to me, and is, different from putting a puzzle together or playing with a cause and effect toy. And also, one of the main reasons why it's different is because there is some non-literal aspect to it. There's something about it that is symbolic or pretend, and non-literal. And to me, that's really important. And that is perhaps one of makes it a simple type of pretend play. And certainly, if nothing else, something that young children engage in often in preschool classrooms. So something that we should teach. The next type of play is symbolic play. And that is play that is pretty clearly symbolic in nature, usually pretty clearly pretend, non-literal focused. And there are three subtypes. These subtypes are well established in the research. Many researchers have identified these, identified that children with disabilities, particularly children with autism, have delays in these types of play, and also have identified some ways to teach these types of play. The three subtypes are object substitution, and that's a really fun one. It's when children are using something as if it's something else. So, using a pen as a phone, or a hat, I guess, probably more likely to be a phone. But really, we see children engage with blocks as a phone, or as a car, or as an airplane, bowls as a hat, pillows as a baby doll. So when children are using something as if it was something else. And so they're pretending the object is something that it isn't. Imagining absent objects is performing an action as if an object was present in the object's absence. So that would be like pretending to put a hat on when I don't have anything in my hand, or pretending, so I've done all these things, pretending to have a cup when I don't have a cup, pretending to drink. So it's kind of like miming, and we see children do this often in classrooms. Probably not as often as the other two types of pretend play, but we certainly see this. And the last one we do see very often, and that's assigning absent attributes. And this is the broadest category, probably could be multiple subtypes. And my students and I have talked about breaking it down into multiple subtypes because there's some differences in complexity within this assigning absent attributes category. But it includes assigning roles or emotions to self, objects, or inanimate objects. So like saying the baby doll is sad, pretending you have, you know, soup in a cup and saying the soup's hot when it isn't. Or assigning a role to yourself, saying I'm the mom or I'm, you know, Wonder Woman. Assigning a role or emotion to yourself that isn't literal. And so you can see this is really wide, this is complex. There are lots of different behaviors that can fall into this category. Most importantly, we see children do this all the time. So now I'm going to show just a few videos of young children engaged in these play behaviors. The first one is functional play with pretense, and so we're going to show some videos. This little one in the corner is one of my favorites. This is Michael. You'll see a couple examples here.
Brushing teeth.
Good model. Oh, good.
Good brushing her teeth, Michael. Good brushing teeth. Good brushing girl's teeth.
And this is Ella.
Go ahead. Reinforce it every time.
So what you see in both of these, so Michael was pretending to brush his teeth without really brushing his teeth. Ella was using a sponge, so it's an actual sponge to clean the baby. Both of these also, and all of these videos occurred, we took these in inclusive classrooms, so it's noisy. They occur, the teachers are the implementers. They occur while every free play is happening in the classroom or center time's happening in the classroom. So it's certainly a little bit noisier than I would like for a video demonstration, but also, you know, I love the noise because it means that we're doing this in a real life classroom. Also, they were all part of a research study where we were focused on teaching them play. So you will see the teachers prompt and reinforce because that's what we do. Okay, shoot, we missed the end of Ella's there. Here, let me go to her. Okay.
I'd model something.
Baby, go for a ride.
And then he pushes the baby. He says the baby's going for a ride in the stroller. Uh-oh.
Go for a ride. Bye. Go ride. Driving baby.
He was a big thrower too, which you'll see in some other videos. I think in this one, this one's really loud. It's happening in the classroom, and there's no carpet in this room, so. So he's drinking from a bottle. He called that a bottle. And then he's dumping the water out. Okay, next I'm going to show you some object substitution. Let's look at Michael again. This one's, oops. This one's not Michael, but we can watch this, and then we'll watch Michael. This little boy was doing a lot of lining up. And then she taught him to make it into a trap. A road. So pretending that those blocks and the hammer is a road, which, you know, I just love it when it's one thing. And so even within object substitution, which is interesting, there's ways to make it more complex. It's one thing to just make a road out of blocks, right? It kind of looks like a road. But she taught him to use something as different as a hammer, which of course is similar. It's long and thin, but quite a bit different from a block. And so he was still pretending those blocks and that hammer were a road, which is interesting and important. And here's Michael again. As I said, he liked to throw toys. He threw toys often.
Driving my car.
So she teaches him to pretend the lid is a steering
Get
wheel.
driving the car, Michael. Get driving.
And again, she's the classroom teacher. I don't know where the other children are right now, but usually they were there. They're certainly not there and being this quiet because this was a 2-year-old classroom. They must be on the playground or something right now. Okay.
Get
So he pretended the block was a slide. And he, a little bit.
Were you gonna slide?
He wanted to slide.
Good sliding, Michael.
He was so proud.
Ring, ring. Hello. How are you? You're making bear talk on the phone. No. Hello. Good job making bear talk.
All right. And then this one is imagining absent objects. I'm going to pick, I think this one is a good one. They're all good ones, but
Yeah. Thank you, Mother.
Okay, when you're cupping the pan, pouring the bowl in the pan, but pouring it out.
how about this one?
Water comes out? Ethan, what else can we do with this water? Let's get the water in the bottle. Whoa! Get the water in the bottle and drink.
So he's pretending water's coming out of that hole, putting it in the bottle and then drinking it. So imagining absent objects. These are exciting. This is Thomas up here. This is assigning absent attributes. So he's eating the corn. So that's functional play of pretense. But then he says it's good. So that's assigning an attribute to it. It's good.
Walk, walk on the spoon. Oh, they need to go home.
Saying the cats need to go home and they're walking.
Down into the bottle.
Oh, you can't get out of here. A bottle's on my head.
A bottle's on my head.
No, bottle fell off.
The bottle fell off.
Okay, cute picture of my son. So those were different types of pretend play. So what I want you to think about as you're seeing all the research that I'm presenting on pretend play, I want you to think about what are the types of, if you have specific children in mind, and what types of play you want to focus on with those children. And we'll talk about some goals for play. While you're teaching play, though, you also always want to think about some other aspects of play that make it play. So the first one is vocalizations. You heard children across these videos using communication, either vocalizations, or we had some sign. Thomas used a little bit of sign. We had Ella, who I don't know if you saw her using sign, but she did use some sign in those one of those first videos I showed. And so while children engage in play, while children play, they talk and they vocalize. And sometimes those vocalizations are really important for confirming the pretend play nature of play, confirming the non-literal aspect. So sometimes for assigning absent attributes, we need to hear the child or see the child say that they're pretending or communicate to us that they're pretending. So we will teach children, if children have an AAC device, I don't have any of those examples here, or use sign, we will teach children to use whatever modality of communication they use to communicate or vocalize while they're playing, because that's really important. We don't want children to just play without also embedding their mode of communication into play. Then we also want to see well, let me start with what we don't want to see. What we don't want to see is children just doing the same thing over and over again all the time. So certainly with infants and toddlers, they do the same thing over and over again. We will see them dump and fill and dump and fill and dump and fill, or line things up. That's perfectly acceptable play for young toddlers and infants, for babies and toddlers, young toddlers. As children grow and develop and into the preschool years, we want to see 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds engage in multiple different types of play. So if you have 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds who are engaged in repetitive, restricted play, which means they're doing the same thing over and over again, then you want to teach them different things to do with those toys. And we often see children with autism or other disabilities engage in really restricted and repetitive play. And that type of play will not lead to the same types of learning opportunities, social opportunities, communication opportunities, or multiple other learning opportunities. And so we want to teach them a broader repertoire of play. It's also why you'll see in all of the research studies that I talk about is I never focus on one specific play behavior. I focus on categories of play rather than, for instance, just teaching the child to rock a baby doll, or teaching the child to play with a boat, or teaching the child to play with a train track. We use play sets that have a variety of different materials in them, usually based on what's in the child's classroom or what the child's known preferences are. And then we will follow the child's lead and engage in multiple different types of play behaviors depending on what they're doing with the toys or what they're attending to. And we do that because we don't want to teach children just one thing to do with one toy set. We want to teach them a broad repertoire of play so that they learn to generate different and multiple play behaviors. We also, relatedly, don't teach children to just do one thing and then move on and do something else. When children play, they engage in multiple consecutive related play behaviors, you know? As you saw in there, they make the track, and then they put the car over the track, and then they swing it around, and then they do it again, and then maybe they add to it. Or they, take a sip, or they pretend to fill up the water bottle, and then they take a sip, and then they dump it out, and then they do it again. They put the bottle on the head, and then it falls off, and then they walk the figure. So they're doing multiple different behaviors in a row. And so we also want to make sure that we're teaching children to do that. And then finally, we don't want this to occur in a bubble. So when we can, we want to do it near other children or with other children. We can absolutely do this in small groups if we need to. Now, there will be children and play behaviors that we need to teach in a one-to-one context with few distractions, and that's perfectly fine. But when we can, we want to then move it to contexts in which we want to see children play, which means playing at least near their peers. More cute pictures. Okay, I'm gonna go over there. 3 kind of overarching play goals. So the first one is if you have children who just aren't playing much at all, then you'll want to increase their frequency or duration of play. And then the next one is complexity of play. Maybe you have children engaged in play most of the day, but they're really doing just kind of really simple play, or they're engaged in really restricted and repetitive play over and over again. So you want to teach them to engage in more complex play. And then finally, and this one, so the first 2 kind of happen in that order. So if you have a child who's not engaging in play at all, just increase the amount of time in which they're playing, and then work on complexity of play. You should always and can always be focusing on play with others. So either near others, remember, think about that social play taxonomy. We can either focus on parallel play, just playing near each other in similar ways, or with each other sharing some toys. Over time, we will want children as they turn 5 and 6 to start to engage in more cooperative play, and that's when they have a common goal and roles, and we'll support that. So now we know what to teach. So we're going to talk about how to increase the frequency or duration of play. And then I'm going to talk about play complexity next. Whoops. So this first research study is one of my favorite research studies that I've conducted. This was a replication of my dissertation. And in this study, we really focused on the generalization of play. So we taught teachers to use the system of least prompts to increase the play behaviors in children in their classroom, children with disabilities in their inclusive classrooms. And then we measured their use of those play skills in the classroom's free play context. So we really focused on that generalized play. And this is the publication, Exceptional Children in 2015. These are the children. They ranged in age from 4 to 5. Actually 3, sorry. Melissa and Casey were almost 4, and Molly and Lewis were 5. Their mental age on the Mullen showed that they have some delays. They had ASD, except for Melissa, who had Down syndrome. Their CARS scored, this was the CARS 1. This study was some years ago. Wow, 10 years ago. But the CARS 1, so these scores are all in the severe autism range. Now, what we also focused on in this study was, remember I said, play is a critically important context. And it turns out lots of people understand and know that. And over again, I see, and I saw in this study, children have goals, IEP goals, or just regular goals that are individualized goals that focus on various skills and occur or are intended to occur within a play context. But children don't have the play skills that they need to have to engage in a play to provide a context for which to focus on the goal. So all of the children in this study had play-related IEP goals, which I found really interesting because none of them had the play skills that would afford them opportunities to learn these goals. And this is a common problem. I see it all the time, have continued to see it. So for instance, Molly had a goal, something along the lines of she will use words, she will vocalize, she will name, she will tact within different items within a play context. The problem was Molly was not playing with adults or peers really at all. She was spending most of her time in the book center, or she was lining up blocks. So there really were few opportunities for her to learn this IEP goal or demonstrate that she could do it. Melissa, along the same lines, had an IEP goal that was play related, and her and Lewis actually had the same goal. And their goal was something along the lines of they will use multiple consecutive related play actions in a play context, but they weren't playing at all. So basically it was saying they will use sequences of play, but they weren't playing at all. They weren't even engaging in one play action. So how were they going to put 2 together? And then Casey had an IEP goal related, something along the lines of Casey will interact with his peers in a play context. Casey's peers were playing great. Many of his peers had, really sophisticated play skills. But Casey himself did not have the play skills that his peers had to afford him opportunities to engage in social interactions within play. And Casey was engaged in a kind of like Molly, very repetitive, restricted play. As I said, I trained the teachers to implement the intervention. So these were teachers in inclusive preschool, and they had a range. These were not licensed teachers. They had a range of levels of experience and education. And it was 4 different classrooms as well. Again, this was a single case research study. I'm not sure if I said this, but all of the studies that I'm going to talk about are single case research studies. And this one in particular was a multiple probe study design. And it was multiple probe across behaviors and toy sets. And I will talk more about that. I'm just going to orient you to the graph in this, so we're not going to get into the data here really. But these are the probe conditions. So probe 1, probe 2, and in the probe, there's no independent variable. So in the probe condition, the independent variable is removed. These are the tiers. The first one is functional play with pretense. This is where the independent variable occurs. So this is tier 1. As I said, it was multiple probe across behaviors and toy sets. So we used the functional play with pretense toy set. The teacher focused on teaching functional play with pretense here. In tier 2 here, the teacher focused on teaching pretend symbolic play skills. And in the final tier, the teacher focused on whatever their play-related IEP goal was. Okay, so the method, the dependent variable was pretend play. As I said, those different types of pretend play, or the IEP goal. So we measured that within each context. For each pretend play behavior, we coded it as unprompted or prompted. Type of play, we coded type of play, whether it was part of a sequence or if it was same or different within that session. So the first time it occurred within each session, it was different. If it occurred again within the session, it was coded as same. We used timed event recording from videos to get a precise frequency of play. The sessions were all 8 minutes in length, so we can refer to a frequency rather than a rate. The independent variable was a system of least prompts hierarchy. In the system of least prompts hierarchy, it's a least to most prompting hierarchy where you start with the natural antecedent, which is putting the toys out and saying, let's play. If the child engages in pretend play after the natural antecedent or the first prompt, then we provide the reinforcement. In this case, we've shifted the reinforcement over time. Well, quite honestly, we'll use whatever works to reinforce the play behavior, but oftentimes we'll have to adjust that as we go within the intervention because reinforcement is part of the system of least prompts, but you need to make sure you have something that is reinforcing, right? Something that actually increases the behavior. And so adjusting that over time is going to be really important. And however, what we like to start with for reinforcement is descriptive talk and a play-related behavior. So if the child engaged in pretend play, such as stirring a spoon in a cup, we might say, wow, you have soup, or look at you're stirring your spoon, and then we would imitate it. We do that because that is a more typical adult response and is less likely to interrupt the play interaction than specific praise. If we said good stirring, they might think they're done and then stop. And also that isn't necessarily reinforcing for all children. So we do that descriptive talk and related play behavior. And then throughout the intervention, and this occurs actually during, it's a controlling variable, a control variable. We implement this during probe and intervention conditions, and this is contingent imitation. It's really just to build a play repertoire between the adult and the child. With contingent imitation, we're imitating what the child's doing when they're doing it. And we do that throughout the session. So, natural antecedent, if the child engages in pretend play, you reinforce. If the child doesn't, you use the less intrusive prompt. And this is about 12 seconds, between 12 and 20 seconds. If the child doesn't engage in pretend play after you give the less intrusive prompt, then you give the controlling prompt. So I'm going to walk through some examples of that. But first, I'm going to review. Contingent imitation is doing exactly what the child's doing immediately after or while they're doing it. And then descriptive talk is talking about what the child's doing and using the language they can understand and imitate. Okay, so here are some examples. And with the system of least prompts, you select the prompts. The hierarchy is there no matter what. You select the specific prompts based on what works for the child. So typically, we will use a model prompt and then hand-over-hand prompting. So a model prompt first and then hand-over-hand prompting is the controlling prompt. But sometimes hand-over-hand prompting is aversive for children, and so they will resist rather than comply with that. So sometimes the first level might be a choice of 2 toys, the doll or the cup, and the next level might be a verbal and physical model. So feed your baby. So I might model it and then talk about what I'm doing. And sometimes that is a controlling prompt. A controlling prompt simply means that it always results in the child accessing reinforcement, so performing the skill. Sometimes we use a verbal and a visual. So in one of those videos you saw we had some visuals for Ella, and that visuals were really effective for her. And so we often said what was in the picture and we showed her a picture. And they were actual pictures of the actual materials and a play action, an adult performing the play action. You can also use videos, little video clips, which we've done occasionally. And then hand-over-hand prompting. So here's some examples.
Watch me drink from the cup and then feed it to the cat. You do it and you get candy. Yeah, you drink it and then feed it to the cat. And then you get candy. So you take a sip.
So she didn't imitate. So in this, we were focused on teaching her sequences. And she only did the first behavior. So then we used hand-over-hand prompting for the second behavior. And what's important there is the adult is allowed to be responsive to the child as well, but has to prompt within the prompt hierarchy and using the same timing.
Yeah, you've got the baby. Two babies. Whoa, what next? Watch me. Cover the baby. And then pat, pat, pat. You do it and you get candy. Yeah. Cover the baby. And
More
then
hand-over-hand prompting.
Very cool.
Yum, yum, yum. The baby's so hungry.
So she's imitating
Yum, yum, yum.
and then feeding the baby a banana.
That is so nice.
So she learns this behavior.
Baby.
And then she pat, pat.
Putting the wash.
So she eventually learns to engage in multiple different types of play behaviors, which was exciting. Now I am going to get to the results. I'm going to talk about the results of this study. Okay, so I really am excited about the data, particularly the red squares, but I'm going to walk through everything first. So, well, I'll just tell you, the red squares are the generalization data, and those are from the free play context. So what's important to note is in the child's free play context. So the open circles and closed triangles are from a context with the teacher who was teaching them in kind of it was one-to-one in the classroom, but there were lots of other things going on. So there were children near them, it was happening in the classroom, but it was the teacher and the child focused with the toy set. Then we also collected these generalization data from the free play context within the classroom. So usually the same day as a session, as one of the sessions, what's also important to know is that oftentimes the same teacher was in free play, and there were very similar toys in the free play context. So I believe that's why our generalization data are so good, but still the generalization are quite good. So here you can see the open circles are prompted play when the teacher's or the child is imitating what the adult's doing, or the adult is using the controlling prompt. And then the closed triangles are unprompted play. And so what you want to see is that line eventually go like this, where you have more unprompted play over time. And then during the probe conditions, remember that's when there's no independent variable at all. So this is really like maintenance, and then maintenance continues for Molly through probe 4, which is quite a bit after the adult taught her to play with those toys. Then we have symbolic play, and again we see some more variability there in unprompted play, but eventually prompted play goes down and unprompted play stabilizes, and it maintains over time. And then the IEP goal. So her IEP goal was descriptive verbalizations during play. So she was essentially talking more about what she was doing, or at least labeling the objects. And this is total unprompted play. Okay, here's Melissa. Very similar data patterns. This blocking is simply she was mouthing. There were some pretend food items in this thing, and so we used a blocking procedure with her then, which helped her engage in more sophisticated play over time. And then this is Casey, and you know, Casey's, I think his IEP goal was the most interesting for me because it was focused on social interactions during play, and you can see that went up. So, you know, somewhat of a different behavior from the play behaviors, and quite a bit of variability, but eventually really stabilizes, and he starts having these really nice social interactions with a couple different peers who he engaged with during his play context. This is Lewis. With many of the children, we have to add, we adapt the reinforcer. So we change the reinforcer depending on what works, what's actually reinforcing for the child. And sometimes reviewers make us mark that on the graph when it's edible. So this is Lewis. We added an edible reinforcer for him during the first tier. Therapists who were working with him were using edible reinforcers for many other skills that he was learning. And so they recommended we use it, and we did, and it was effective. Of course, it's important to thin over time to a more typical or naturally occurring reinforcer, which we were able to do by the second tier. So we stopped using the edible reinforcer here, and then we moved to just verbalization, descriptive verbals from adult. Okay, so these data are also really exciting. What we also, as I said, we coded whether it was the same or different behavior within each session. And we saw the children, across children, they used more different play behaviors over time, which was really exciting. Oops. And Casey and Lewis as well. I should have mentioned, I forgot to mention, probe 4, we couldn't do with Lewis because the school year ended, as happens. All of the children increased their vocalizations during play, which was exciting. Now, I underlined Molly's up here because that happened to be her IEP goal. So we see a big increase in Molly's because that's what we were focused on. Okay, so that study, we taught teachers within a classroom to teach children to engage in kind of this generalized play. We saw increases transfer to their free play contexts with similar adults and toys. So, and we use the system of least prompts, which is something that has been used often to teach play. In this next study, we wanted to see if a single prompt procedure would be effective and maybe more feasible, because it potentially might be more feasible. And so we used the system, we did use contingent imitation, But in this study, we specifically focused on constant time delay rather than the system of least prompts. And I will walk you through that. We had 3 children, and Lauren was you just saw some videos of Lauren, actually. Lauren had a seizure disorder, an IEP eligibility category of developmental delay, which Toby and Lucas had as well. Toby had Down syndrome and Lucas had Down syndrome, and they were all 4. Lucas had just turned 5, and Toby and Lauren were 4 and a half-ish. These were their disabilities and their ages. We used the exact same research design, multiple probe across toy sets, and it met dependent variables. We used the same measurement procedures. The major difference was, of course, our use of constant time delay rather than system of least prompts. So in constant time delay, you have a few trials where you deliver the antecedent and immediately deliver the controlling prompt. And as children wait for that, and if prompted behaviors are high, then you can start to delay. You delay the delivery of the controlling prompt. You use its constant time delay. So you use the same delay interval during every trial. And for us, we used 5 seconds because we wanted, sometimes it's shorter, sometimes it's longer. We think 5 seconds was appropriate for giving the child an opportunity to engage in play. We had to make instructional adaptations, which I make in almost all of my research studies, based on what worked for the child. And so within the constant time delay procedures, though, for Toby and Lucas, for Lauren, you'll see we actually found that constant time delay was not effective really at all. And so we switched to the use of system of least prompts. For Toby, we used a physical prompt, then we used a model prompt, and then we just handed him the materials. And then for Lauren, we used the system of least prompts and a visual schedule. We had to make changes to the reinforcement for Toby and Lauren as well, but not for Lucas. Here is Toby's. Sorry, let me go back. So this is, I call this enhanced baseline, because what we saw here is, as I said when I talked about the previous study, I use contingent imitation as a control variable. I use it across conditions because the independent variable is really then just the response prompting procedure. So system of least prompts, in this case, it was constant time delay. What we found with Toby is we used contingent imitation and we talked about what Toby was doing, and we found that he had higher than expected levels of, unprompted play. So I wondered if just simply imitating him and talking about what he was doing was enough to increase his play behaviors. And so we embedded a little withdrawal design into it. We removed the contingent imitation, and we found that his play tanked, completely tanked. In fact, by the end of this session, he basically just laid on the carpet and wouldn't even look at us. So in some ways, it was an aversive context for him. We brought back the enhanced baseline, then we did CTD. We didn't see much increase with him at all. Whether it was because we exposed him to this withdrawal or just the baby set, we're not sure, but we didn't see much increase at all with babies. So we started with the next toy set, kitchen. We saw some nice increases, and same with vehicles. We can't say anything about functional relation here. We do have clear behavior change in the second and the third tier, but because we don't have clear behavior change in the first tier, we can't say anything about a functional relation. Now with Lucas, we decided to do the same thing. We saw similar results during his withdrawal condition, but then we had some nice increases in unprompted play. And then, which we found also for the other 2 toy sets. So we can conclude a functional relation here. An unprompted different So the open circles are unprompted play, and then the red triangles are unprompted different. I just want to highlight that we saw nice increases in diversity of play. And then for Lauren, like I said, we did CTD and we probably did a little bit longer than we should. There was quite a bit of variability. And we eventually just said, you know what, this is not working. Let's try SLP. So we tried the system of least prompts, and we saw an immediate increase in unprompted play. And then similar increases with the other two toy sets, which, by the way, were randomly assigned to tiers across children, and also had increases in her diversity of play, which was exciting. The next study, the third study I'm going to talk about, is where we focused on the use of the system of least prompts, increase the level of target play behaviors. And so we had different target play behaviors in young children. I'm gonna go over this. These are the children. These children, this study, we had younger children. So we had children who were, in some cases, not quite 2 yet. They were 2 and Lewis was 3. So Maxine was 2, John was 1.5, Tulsi was almost 3, 2, over 2.5, and Lewis had just turned 3. And they had a range of disabilities. We used the same design, except this was a multiple probe across participants. And we really had focused target play behaviors, and everything met procedures. So this, like I said, it was a multiple probe without probe conditions. So we did probe days, and we focused across participants, as you can see here. So it went across Maxine, John, Tulsi, and Lewis. And again, these children were really young. And remember, John was 18 months. He was the youngest. And so across children, you will see closed triangles are unprompted play, and open triangles are unprompted play. And then the open circles are unprompted different, which we thought was quite exciting, that we saw children increase the diversity of play as well. And so I know this tiered graph is too hard to read, so I'm going to just break it up into tiers. So Maxine, remember, she had Down syndrome, and she engaged in, or no, let me see. Maxine did not have Down syndrome. Maxine had cerebral palsy and developmental delay. That's right. Tulsi had Down syndrome. They were both not quite 3 yet, though. So we saw a nice increase in unprompted play, and some pretty stable diversity of play there too, which was nice. John, it took a while. He had quite a bit of variability, which makes sense for a toddler who's 18 months with developmental delay. But eventually we saw some good, stable, unprompted play and increases in diversity too. Tulsi was the little girl with Down syndrome. We saw quite a bit of variability here. In this example, she's doing the same thing over and over again. So these open circles are what we found to be most exciting with Tulsi. She's engaged in multiple different types of play behaviors during each session. And then Lewis, we saw some nice increases as well. Across all these studies, I measured social validity, and the results were always good, moderate to exceptional social validity. In this study, in particular, we had masked raters look at pre and post videos, and we saw, across all 3 of the participants except for John, all 4 of the participants, increases based on the masked raters except for John, which also we saw in his data. His data were the least, they were the lowest. There was some behavior change there, but it wasn't as high as with the other children. So what we concluded was that SLP was functionally related to an increase in level of target play, and increases maintained over time. And engaged in different play behaviors over time. So now what I want to focus on is how to, so we talked about how to increase the frequency and duration of play. So we had those 3 different studies, SLP, CTD, and then SLP with toddlers, really young children. So now I want to talk about how we can increase the complexity of play with young children. So again, I'm going to show just some pictures of my son. And in this study, we really focus on the diversity of play. So we look at, does prompting and reinforcement of diverse play behaviors increase the diversity of play in a preschooler with autism? And we used a comparison study, and I'm going to go over that in one. I'm going to go over the design, but first I'm going to tell you about Missy. So Missy was a little girl with autism. She was almost 4 years old. She turned 4 during the course of the study. Her mental age was about 24 months based on the Mullen. And like I said, she had ASD. In this study, because it was a comparison design where we were looking at ways to increase the complexity of play, and her use of different play behaviors, we used what's called a multi-treatment design, where we had an A condition, which was baseline, a B condition, where we reinforced all play behaviors, and then a C condition, where we reinforced only diverse play behaviors. And this allowed us to compare the different types of reinforcement, the different reinforcement schedules. It was also IOA and procedural fidelity met design standards, which is true for all the studies I'm presenting today. The dependent variable was pretend play behaviors, and we measured it the same way, used the exact same code actually in ProCoder DB as we have in the 3 previous studies that I talked about. We measured unprompted or prompted play, type of play, sequence or no sequence, and then same or different. Remember, in this study, this diversity of play, same or different, was the primary dependent variable, what we both prompted and what we made condition change decisions based on. We again used timed event recording using ProCoder DB. So we had 4 different conditions. We used contingent imitation across all of the conditions, which makes it a control variable. We also used verbal mapping. Like I said, we used that in the 3 previous studies as well, both of these things actually. We used contingent imitation and verbal mapping, which is simply doing what the child's doing right when they do it, to imitate what they're doing, and also to talk about what they're doing, to give them language based on what they're doing. What's important to know, though, is during these baseline conditions, when we're using contingent imitation and verbal mapping, we are not prompting new behaviors. We're simply talking about what the child's doing and imitating what they're doing. In condition B and C, we use the system of least prompts. In condition B, we use the system of least prompts and reinforced all play. In condition C and condition C prime, we reinforced only diverse play, so only different play behaviors. In condition C, we both prompted and reinforced diverse play behaviors, different play behaviors. In condition C prime, we removed the prompting and only provided reinforcement. This study has been published in Focus in Autism and Developmental Disabilities. So this is a graph. I'm going to walk you through each of the conditions. This is baseline. This is first condition B, where we're using the system of least prompts. Again, in baseline and this first condition, we're using contingent imitation and verbal mapping. You can see here pretend play goes up, which is exciting. Sequences stays really low, and the closed circles are diverse pretend play, and again, that was our primary dependent variable. So you can see it's pretty low. She's using 3 or 4 per session. There's some variability, but it doesn't increase by much. It goes up to about 5 for 1 session in this B condition. And when we introduce C, when we're reinforcing different play, it increases quite a bit. Her diverse play increases and stabilizes. What's also exciting is her total play stayed pretty stable after having a pretty steep increasing trend in the first B condition. We went back to B, and you see that diverse play goes down when we're reinforcing all pretend play here. When we reintroduce the C condition, where we are using system of least prompts to prompt diverse play and reinforce, we have a nice increasing trend through the C condition. And then during C prime, where we wanted to remove the prompting and only reinforce, we actually see the level, of course, some variability, which we would expect when we're not prompting as often, but we do see, we're still reinforcing, and we see she's engaged in a lot of repetitive behavior, so a lot of the same behaviors, but some new behaviors within each session, which is really exciting. And the level stays about the same as the last C condition, which was exciting. So again, this is further evidence that the system of least prompts is effective. However, what we found in this study is that play diversity increased only when targeted, intentionally targeted, and reinforced. And what we know based on the characteristics of children with ASD is that this might be particularly important given their propensity for sameness and repetition. It might be really important to focus on diversity of play, but if we want to see an increase in diversity of play, we're really going to have to intentionally prompt and reinforce those behaviors. Okay, now we're on research study number 5. So in this study, we actually were still, in the graph of Missy's graph, we measured sequences. We wanted to see if her sequences went up. What we found is that they didn't increase at all. We kind of thought, we hypothesized they might, given we were so focused on diversity of play, that she might start to engage in some different sequences as well, but we didn't see an increase in her sequences in play. So we did a follow-up study with her, again, where we focused on sequences of play. So we wanted to look at, does the system of least prompts increase sequences of play? Does the skill maintain over time, and does it generalize? So Missy was a little bit older when we started this study. She had turned 4, and of course had ASD, as I said before. We used a multiple probe across toy sets design in this study. So in the previous study, we used a multi-treatment design. In this study, we used a design that was more similar to the first 3 studies that I presented. So this was a multiple probe across toy sets. And it was, again, designed to meet design standards. We focused in this study on sequences of pretend play. So again, we prompted sequences and we reinforced sequences. So they had to be 2 different but related actions, with the second one occurring within 3 seconds of the offset of the first. And they had to be related. We continued to measure the same behaviors just as we had in the previous study using the same code, timed event recording with ProCoder DB. IOA was great for this study. Control variables, everything was the same as in the previous studies. We used contingent imitation, verbal mapping. The independent variable was the system of least prompts focused on sequences and reinforcement for sequences. So this is the hierarchy, prompt hierarchy we use. This should be familiar to you by now. I've showed you this a couple times. Related to the sequences of play, related to the system of least prompts, where you have the natural antecedent. If the child doesn't engage in the target behavior, which in this case was sequences of play, you deliver the first level prompt. The child doesn't imitate, which in this case was a verbal and a model prompt. If the child doesn't imitate the model, then you use the controlling prompt, which in this case was hand over hand prompting. I'm going to skip that video because it's not Missy, but it's another video of the system of least prompts, and I'm going to go back and show it in a second. We also looked at maintenance and generalization in this study, and this is the graph. Okay, let me go back. I'm going to show you the system of least prompts. This is a video.
I told him to sit. He's like, no. And I was like, no, whatever. Maybe you know how to do it. So squeeze it onto different pieces. It may not go back together. It's perfect. It's almost done, and then we're taking your skin. Timer. Okay, let's prompt. Which is why you
So she imitated the model there. And you can see there's a coach in the background. And it also takes place in a classroom. So he's imitating.
So she is Drew's cover?
It's
like she wanted you to do it first. Like 30 minutes. Yep.
Are you okay?
Continually imitating.
You just keeps doing it, so he keeps imitating. So cute. And you can hear him, he's not saying good playing, he's saying, wow, she's so hungry. So what I want to highlight about this too is that as you saw in this video, when you use contingent imitation, oftentimes, and the reason why we use that, there are two reasons. One is to build the play repertoire, as I said earlier, because if the adult is imitating what the child's doing, the adult then has perhaps a better idea of what to prompt. And better sense of how to follow the child's lead in play. Also, when you're contingently imitating the child often looks at you. And so you don't have to use the attending cue often because the child's already looking at you, which is helpful. So this is the graph from our multiple probe study. So we had twice at 1, twice at 2, twice at 3, and the closed circles are unprompted sequences, as you can see here. And what's great is the unprompted sequences go up. Of course, there's some variability, and it takes quite a bit of time, especially in the first tier, but this is consistent from what we've seen in previous research. And the second and third tier take fewer sessions to reach mastery criterion. What we found really exciting is that the sequences increased and maintained with some variability over time, which was exciting for us to see for her. So what we found is that SLP can be used as a means to increase play behaviors in young children with autism. But as we saw in the study, and actually I didn't highlight it in the graph here, reinforcement is often needed to continue to observe increases in levels. So in maintenance, we actually removed reinforcement, and these lines here are when we added reinforcement back and then changed the schedule of reinforcement. So what we found is that if you remove all prompting and reinforcement in the same time, you will often see a decrease in target behaviors, although that was variable across tiers. Which tells us that reinforcement is critically important, and that we should teach children how to access reinforcement and to make sure that we're delivering reinforcement at schedules that maintain behaviors at levels that we want to see. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about how to increase frequency and duration of play, and we talked about how to increase play complexity. So now we're going to talk a little bit about social play. And again, that's a cute little picture of my child. Again, over here. Okay. So in this study, we focused on teaching children how to play board games with each other. So we looked at, we used a multiple probe across participants design, and we looked at the relation between SLP and appropriate unprompted board game play. And we also looked at social communication as a DV, so we'll talk about that. And this is the 6th study. In this study, all of the sessions were again conducted in an inclusive preschool. However, in this study, we did this during what was a nap time for the children. And so this was for some of the children who didn't nap during nap time. And so we did it in a separate room in the school. So that reduces our ecological validity somewhat, but I would love to see replications of this conducted directly in the classroom. We use these board games created by, what is it called? Peaceful Kingdom. Peaceful Kingdom is the brand. And I, have no tie to this Peaceful Kingdom brand. You can use a variety of board games. The reason why we picked these is because there's no winner. So they're all about cooperation and playing with each other, and both player, or all the players, you can have more than one for some of these games. Usually they're 2 to 4. All the players work together towards a common goal. So they're cooperative and they really facilitate cooperative play. And so we wanted to use games that were consistent in that regard. Again, replications or using these procedures with other types of board games is probably feasible and likely effective, although lots more research is needed regarding board game play with young children. There's really a dearth of research in this area, and it's such a great activity, especially these days as kids are stuck at home. As with all of the research that I presented today, IOA and procedural fidelity met design standards, met and usually exceeded. These were our children. We had Elizabeth, Kamala, Tammy, and Bernie. Elizabeth had autism, Kamala had DeGeorge syndrome, Tammy had a visual impairment and some intellectual disabilities. Bernie was at risk for social delays based on teacher report. And we did an ASQ SE with him, the Ages and Stages Questionnaire, Social Emotional, and it confirmed his at-risk status. And these were the race, ethnicity, and then these were the ages. So Bernie was the youngest. He was not quite 3, although he turned 3 during the course of the study. And then Kamala and Tammy Kamala was 5, Tammy was 4, and Elizabeth was 3, almost 4. So there was a range of ages. These are our dependent variables. So we focused on gameplay behavior, and we defined that as the correct completion of an individual step during the board game. We operationalized each turn for each child within each board game as being 4 steps, just to have some functional equivalence within the board games in the DV. And then we coded each from video using ProCoder DV as UPC, unprompted correct, prompted correct, unprompted error, or prompted error. We also measured social communication. You'll see this was a little bit trickier to measure and a little bit we didn't see the outcomes that we thought we would. So the independent variable was included peer training and the intervention, which was the system of least prompts, and we used a visual schedule with 4 steps for each game. We did the peer training before we started the study. So before we started the baseline condition. And the reason why we did that is because we didn't want the peers, the children without disabilities, to satiate or get bored with the game, which we thought might happen if they don't know how to play. So we taught the peers, so the peers knew how to play the game during the baseline condition and of course during intervention. And this is that was an example of the visual. We used the system of least prompts. We used gesture and verbal prompt as the first prompt level, and then we used model and verbal mapping as the second and third levels. We made a modification for both Bernie and Elizabeth to use hand-over-hand prompting as the controlling prompt. This is a video. You can see, and in this study too, which is different from the other studies that I've talked about, the implementer was a researcher. So this is one of my doc students, and these are 2 of the children in the study. Let me say first that this is muted at the beginning because she says the child's name, and we want to make sure that the child's name is not um, said out loud. And also, I don't think I mentioned this, but each child, each target child was paired with a peer or a couple peers from their classroom who had typical development, and we rotated peers. So the target children played with multiple different peers over the course of the study. All the peers, again, were trained before baseline started.
What's first?
So verbal and gesture.
You got it, girl. I wonder what color she'll get.
Purple.
Purple.
You tell them to
Matching.
match
Awesome.
it.
Nice.
And then
That was
this is
fast.
called snug as a bug in the rug, and you slip it underneath.
What's next?
So again, gesture and verbal. And we strategically
Can you touch my feet?
took some tokens away
Pass it to your friend
sometimes
and say your turn.
to make sure that the game didn't last too long. And then because she didn't comply with the gesture, then she did the model. And so that's what you saw. We had great results in this study. It was really exciting. This has been published in the Journal of Positive Behavioral Interventions. We identified a functional relation, had experimental control, and had some good generalized effects for some of the children. Because this graph is too hard to read here, we broke it down by tier. So this is the first tier. This is Elizabeth. We introduced hand-over-hand prompting, as I said. Elizabeth was a child with ASD. Once we introduced hand-over-hand prompting as the controlling prompt, we saw an increase in level with quite a bit of variability, but eventually it increased. We adapted the reinforcement throughout the intervention to identify something that worked. Then with Kamala, we saw really nice immediate increase in unprompted correct that maintained over time. And we saw a really nice increase in for Tammy as well, that also maintained. Bernie, like with Elizabeth, Bernie was our youngest participant, and he was identified as being at risk. This is where we added hand-over-hand prompting, and we saw an immediate increase. Again, we adapted what we used as reinforcement here a little bit. And then we saw a nice increasing trend with some variability, and eventually it increased, and he met mastery criterion, and it maintained over time. So we saw really nice increases in board game play. We did not see the same increases in social communication, which was surprising to us. We think it's an artifact of how we measured it. Because anecdotally, we did see and hear the children talking more after the intervention started about the board game, but our measurement didn't capture that and didn't show that. So we'd love to see some replications of that. The quality of social communication really increased over time, which of course we only have anecdotal information about, but we, again, like I said, love to see replications of this over time. Okay. We found this study to confirm there are a few previous studies. Some other researchers, just a few, have looked at board game play. Most of them also use a least to most prompt hierarchy. So our research supports previous research in this area. But like I said, there are just a handful of studies. So more research needs to be conducted looking at board game play with young children. We also found that the board game play generalized across peers and games, which was really exciting, which means, that teachers can teach, a handful of students to play a game, and they'll generalize to other students in the classroom, which is great. We found that it didn't generalize for Elizabeth. Elizabeth was our one participant with ASD, and we hypothesized that Elizabeth would probably need more intensive instruction related to a generalized board game play. I should also mention that we rotated between 3 games. So all of the instructional sessions, we randomly selected the board game that we chose, that we played with across 3 games to facilitate generalized board game play. So all of those data are from 3 games. And then we had 1 generalization board game that we measured that we never taught. We never used the instructional procedures with. There were lots of important implications for practice. Systematic prompting was affected. We had to make adaptations, as we see over and over again, based on the child's response. Generalization was strong, and system of least prompts is related to play. And here's the citation. Okay, our 7th study. Getting into the home stretch. This study is focused on block play. So in this study, we also used dyads, a child with a disability and one of their typically developing peers. But in this study, we taught dyads how to engage with blocks, to engage in block play. We had Elliot, Megan, Toby, and Matt. Toby was actually in one of the previous studies that I talked about, so he had been in a previous study focused on play. And they ranged from, Elliot was considered at risk for EBD, which we confirmed, which was based on teacher and parent report. Megan had a developmental delay. That was her IEP eligibility category. Toby had Down syndrome, and Matt had cleft palate and Pierre-Robin syndrome. They all, I'm sorry, Megan, Toby, and Matt had IEPs. Elliot did not. Elliot had just turned 3, and Matt had just turned 3, and the other 2, Megan and Toby, were both 4. These are their ages. So you might be wondering why block play is important. I've talked quite a bit already about why play is important. Well, block play is important because it's also a typical activity that children engage in. And what we know about blocks is children might be more likely to engage in object substitution with blocks or other pretend play, symbolic play behaviors, because blocks themselves are vague in objects that can potentially stand for multiple different objects. Block play provides opportunities to improve motor skills, spatial awareness, and has been studied quite a bit in the early childhood literature. Not as much in the autism or special ed or ABA literature, although there are some early studies by applied behavior analysts who have looked at block play. There's a hierarchy of block play complexity, and so what we decided to do is to focus on 2 kind of overarching categories: construction of block construction, so just making things, and pretend play, so explicitly using blocks to stand for something else. We used those different levels to measure block play in our study. Hello. So we used a variety of different strategies to increase block play. Again, we were focused on increasing the complexity of block play with young children. We used some peer support. We used reinforcement, of course. We used play expansions. And then we also individualized and used imitation as well. We knew that, we know that block play provides opportunities for young children to play together, and really, especially in inclusive settings, affords multiple opportunities for children to play together. And so we used peer support. So like I said, we did this in dyads where we had a child, one of the target children, and then a typically developing peer. This was all done in children's classrooms too. We imitated the child's block action, so we used contingent imitation. And we also used play expansion. So we expanded on what the child was doing with the blocks to teach a more complex type of play. Of course, we used reinforcement. And so this is kind of what it looks like. The child builds, the teacher imitates, the teacher expands, and the teacher reinforces a more complex block play behavior. And here's a video.
I'm gonna get the little marbles like you and I'm gonna line them up. Boop-a-da-boo. Boop-a-da-boo.
So she was imitating.
It's up to so creative.
And she reinforces.
I'm gonna add a second layer.
And she expands.
All right, Prince.
He got very excited when he started imitating her more complex block play. We also know that individualization might be important, and so we ended up adding some prompting, some individualized prompting. We also created visuals to show children different block structures to support their use of more complex play. And of course, we adapted reinforcement as needed. So we changed the prompting procedure a little bit to where the child builds, teacher imitates, expands, and then the teacher prompts. And then we added these visuals that went along with what we were prompting. So they were different types of block structures. We created all the visuals ourselves based on what the children had been doing with the blocks. And then we provided individualized reinforcement. So here's an example.
I have the blocks that look like this. I'm gonna add this long block to close it in to make it look like this picture. Close yours in too. You made it look just like this picture, so you get an M&M.
Okay, so what we were most interested in was increasing complexity of block play. So we measured that as well, and I'm going to show you those data. We also were interested, though, in just their engagement with blocks during the intervention sessions, because we wanted to increase their engagement in blocks in the classroom as well. And what we found is minimal changes in the duration of their engagement in blocks. So we used momentary time sampling with 2-second intervals. So every 2 seconds, we indicated whether or not they were engaged with blocks for each session, and didn't see much change over time. You have both children, both the target and the peer child, on each graph. We didn't see big changes in their complexity of play or in their pretend play with blocks, which I'm going to show you in 1 second. So as I said, what we found is we didn't see big changes in engagement. And I'm going to show you the graphs for increasing complexity of play in a second. And essentially what we concluded was that more additional research is needed to really identify effective strategies for increasing complexity of block play. One of the kind of barriers in this study was measurement of block play. We found it difficult to measure block play because it was hard to see what children were doing from the video recordings, and it was really hard to record or to code live. And so as children engage in more complex block play, it's difficult to really measure what they're doing. So we know that some work is needed to really identify more effective strategies for teaching block play, also identify ways to measure block play. So you can see here there are minimal changes from baseline to intervention in complexity of block play. But there were some nice increases when we added visuals. but they weren't consistent across children. Okay, we are on the last and final study. And in this study, I focused on how to train teachers to increase play in children, and really focused on children with disabilities. So we know that in most of these studies, some of them we used researchers. I should have mentioned in the last study, the block play study, those were researchers, those were graduate students who were implementing the intervention. But in many of the studies, I think 6 out of 8, 5 out of 7 of the previous studies, we used actual teachers. And then of course in this one, there were actual teachers as well. So 6 out of 8. This study that I'm about to present is published in Teacher Ed and Special Ed. So I'm really within this 8th study, I'm actually, and within that publication, there are actually 2 studies I'm going to talk about. So in this first one, in baseline, we just said teach the children to play. Then we did this didactic training with the teachers where we taught them contingent imitation, SLP, and what the pretend play taxonomy is, what the dependent variables were, what the target behaviors are. We used manual, lecture, videos, and role play. And then we measured their use of the SLP and contingent imitation. And then we added coaching. So we added a checklist, live prompting, performance-based feedback, and a post-session checklist. So I, rarely use color on my graphs, but I do often when I present, just so you can see the data patterns. So this is baseline pre-training. This is post-training, but no coaching. And the red are errors, and the blue, the open circles, are correct prompts. And then the triangles are contingent imitation. Contingent imitation is on the right-hand scale, so this is a dual ordinate graph. We have the errors and correct prompts on the left scale, y-axis scale, and the right scale is percentage of intervals with contingent imitation, which we measured using momentary time sampling. So it was really the duration, the estimated duration of contingent imitation. So we had, after just training, we saw no increases in correct use of prompts. As you can see, the blue is pretty low, red is pretty high, minimal increases in contingent imitation. But if anything, at least 2 of the teachers increased their contingent imitation somewhat. I should have said this design is a multiple baseline across teachers. When we added coaching, that's when we saw the differentiation. That's when we saw the arrows go down, the correct prompts go up, and contingent imitation go up. Now, we saw those change at that pattern with the first 4 teachers. By the time we got to Betty, we said, you know what, this didactic training alone isn't working at all. So with Betty, we went right to coaching and saw an immediate increase. So then, because we really thought the training would be effective, because we really, even though we knew from the research that coaching was critically important, we really thought, because we used a training based on behavioral skills training, where we provided feedback during the training. We we really thought we had a really high quality didactic training, so we thought we would see increases. So the coaching was kind of an add-on when we didn't see the increases. So then we decided to do a follow-up study where we really focused on operationalizing the coaching. So thinking about what do we mean by coaching, and we trained the coaches. So we trained the coaches to use consistent procedures. And then the coaching involved a checklist, some in vivo live prompting, and lots of performance-based feedback. And we wanted to be consistent with the feedback, so we asked them to use about 5 comments per session. And you can see really nice changes with the coaching. So the errors go down, the red goes down, and the correct prompts goes up. And this is almost immediate for all of the teachers. Now, what's really exciting too is that these were teachers in classrooms with children. They were pre-service teachers, actually teachers in training in a graduate program, who were working in classrooms. The green circle and the arrow is pointing to sessions with a generalization child, so this is not the target child who they've used for all the other sessions, which really shows us that they are generalizing their use of these procedures across children, which we found to be really exciting. And what I think is also exciting is the child data. So this is the target child data, not the generalization children data. So these are the target children. What we see here is with low fidelity use of the intervention, we see really low levels of unprompted pretend play. The children increase their use of pretend play with higher fidelity use of the intervention, which of course is critically important to consider. I want to say that sometimes it's important for us to think about fidelity as a threshold and that there's a level of fidelity. We often like to say it's 80%, but we don't really know if 80% is enough to get children to use target behaviors at an adequate level, a socially valid level. Sometimes less than 80%, lower than 80% might be adequate. But in this study, we know that these higher levels of fidelity resulted in higher levels, or are associated with higher levels of child unprompted pretend play, which was exciting. Okay, so that is the research in a nutshell that I've conducted on increasing the complexity of play with young children. What we found is that the system of least prompts plus contingent imitation is related to increases in generalized object play, sequences of object play, diversity of object play, and play-related behaviors. We found in one study that CTD, constant time delay, was effective for 2 children, but not the third. So really at this point, there's a robust literature to support the use of the least to most prompting hierarchy to increase play with young children. We also looked at board game play, some social play, so board game play, and block play. I think both areas need quite a bit of additional research, particularly block play. There's very few studies that have focused on block play, how to teach block play to children with disabilities. There's a lot of descriptive research out there. But blocks are in every classroom, and so I think it's really important to start to look at the most effective and efficient procedures for teaching block play. In the meantime, we can certainly start with the system of least prompts and to use the procedures that we used in that study, which involved expansion, imitation, visuals, and prompting. The other thing that I want to mention, and then I'll get to the last 2 points, is one thing you'll see in all of these studies, and it's critically important for us to realize and to emphasize and to know, is that reinforcement needs to be individualized, and that we really have to think about what are the levels of target behavior that we want children to engage in, what is an actual reinforcer for the child, not just a preference, what is something that actually reinforces the target behaviors, and we need to use that at a schedule that gets the behavior to a level that is socially valid for the child, and then think about how to thin that reinforcement to something that is naturally occurring in the context and the environment for the child. But we absolutely have to think about reinforcement, and I think all too often we forget to focus on that aspect of our instructional procedures. Across these studies, there were very few that really focused on generalization. Of course, there were a couple that I mentioned, but we need more research that really focuses on how to teach that generalized play and how to teach children to engage in a generalized repertoire of play where they are constantly generating new play behaviors. And then across all these studies, I really think that there's no reason why we ever have to teach play in isolation, that we can teach play with peers, we can teach play in contexts near peers, in classrooms, and we really should be thinking about always thinking about how to increase child's social play behaviors. And then I have more gratuitous pictures of my son engaged in play. And these are all of the many students who I've worked with over the years. And this list is actually a year old and needs some updating. And please, if anybody has any questions or any concerns or any comments about any of this, I would love to hear from you. I love talking about this research, and I would be happy to email back and forth with anybody about any of this research. So please send me an email.